Let's talk about child's pose and how it might not feel comfortable for you. Child's pose is actually a lot of hip flexion and knee flexion. So if you don't have a great amount of either of those things, child's pose is not going to feel like a restful, easy pose for you. So if we're coming from quadruped, if we shift our hips back, two things happen immediately. As our hips move back, our hips are coming into flexion. Now that's a deep hip flexion. Your thigh is very close to your torso. That's the action of flexing the hips. So this, if you could imagine that you could be this close standing, it might make sense that you feel like you're stuck up much higher with the hips. Same thing with the knees. As the hips come back, the knees are bending as we try to bring the butt to the heel. That's flexing the knee, so this might not feel great in the knee. It also might not feel great because of your feet. As we come back, if the toes are down, we're plantar flexing the ankles. And if you keep the toes tucked, we're dorsiflexing the ankles. So if you think about all of those aspects, if you improve that hip mobility, your hip flexion, your knee flexion, and your ankle flexion, child's pose might feel a little bit better for you. So if I were to stand and do all of those things, ankle dorsiflexion, when we're standing, our ankles are dorsiflexed, but you can go into it more by coming into something like a squat, where your heels are going to want to lift up or your toes are going to want to lift up. And so keeping the feet flat as you move, that would be a dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion is lifting the toes when you're doing something like this. Plantar flexion would be pointing the toes. So when you're pointing here, that's plantar flexing. Plantar flexing, you could also have the toes extended while you do that, but it's this action of the ankle. So this versus this of the ankle. Toes tucked is going to be this action of the ankle, and toes untucked is this action of the ankle. So if you just assess your dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, that might give you a clue on why either of those options might not feel great. Now, if I flex my hips standing, that's thigh to the torso. So if you try this out, how far can you get your torso toward the thigh comfortably without rounding the back or changing the spine? So if you think of a child's pose, sitting the butt way back to the heels, that's this much hip flexion. So if you're standing and you're nowhere near this, that might explain why child's pose doesn't feel good. Let's talk about knee flexion. So that's bending the knees. If we're flexing the knees, and this doesn't feel good for you, child's pose would be a deep flexion of the knees. So if your knees are not coming into this range of motion in any other way, if this is not available, then this isn't going to feel good to have your weight shifting back, really moving into that knee flexion. So if you're not a fan of child's pose, or you don't like that it's called a resting pose, that might be why. You never have to do it if you don't want, but if you do want to find it more comfortable, work on the action of flexing the hips, flexing the knees, and flexing the ankles.